Welcome everyone to the question and answer session of this year's Taylor Lectures. I'm joined by Regius Professor Graham Ward, who is sitting in his office at Oxford University. We're sorry you're not here live with us, but we are very grateful for your 3 lectures. And I want to say how much I personally enjoyed listening to them. And I have not heard as many artists brought into a series of serious theological lectures as you have introduced, including some real great artists. I grew up in Northern California, so the second lecture, which featured Ansel Adams, was very near and dear to my own heart, having spent a good bit of time in Yosemite. So thank you. If you are joining us and you would like to pose a question, we are using the Q&A function on my screen. It's at the bottom of the screen. It may be elsewhere, but just Q&A. Please type your question in and I will pose the questions to Professor Ward and let him respond. So let's start without any further ado. So Graham, the first question comes from a member of our faculty. And it's, I think, very clear. Let me just read it. I was struck in your third lecture by your articulation of a temptation to take theology out and the humility of your concession that theology has no monopoly on assessing, appreciating, or naming what happens in soul time. You did end by naming what happens in soul time as processes of incarnation in which the inner and derivative logos is made consonant with the external logos. Is this then simply one naming of what happens in soul time, a theological naming? Is it important that this particular kind of naming continue? And if so, for whom and why?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question because it helps me to make a distinction between, say, what I'm trying to do and what other kind of people in the phenomenology of religion try to do. So in the phenomenology of religion, which takes quite a Kantian line, basically, that says that, well, you know, there is the ultimate reality, and we have all these metaphors, symbols, models, analogies that we can use, and the Christian one is a set of languages that we can use, and we can translate those languages because they're all really languages that we're appending to the ultimate reality. I am not saying that. I am not saying that, because what I'm trying to say is there is not one reality. So what soul time participates in, we have to give some kind of language, because right throughout the whole point has been that we are searching for our language. Even God is just a name that we give to the searching for that language. Within the language group that I would understand, this is my language would be incarnational. But in that, what I'm trying to get at is that what is incarnational about it is the processes itself is incarnating. And this is quite a difference between what I'm trying to do and what dogmatics is trying to do. If I were doing the incarnation from a dogmatic point of view, I might start from the stories in the gospel, for example. I might want to talk about, you know, the relation of incarnation to Christology. But in fact, what I'm trying to do here is get at what are the processes of the incarnating. And I think those processes of the incarnating, whether you name it in a Christian way or not, you know, they are the same processes. And that's part of the reason what I wanted to do really from lecture 2 was not use people who are using the Christian language, but showing that the same processes of encountering something which is impacting upon them forces them to actually find some means of expressing. And every one of them find that what has been expressed and given to them is inadequate or not quite what they want in terms of doing, in terms of moving forward. I think one of the key people here for me is someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins, who obviously does work within that Christian tradition. But in a letter in 1870s to his friend Robert Bridges, he says, I have to find a new language because I have to find a new language because there will be no knowledge unless I find a new language. So it's a finding a new language. And in that, what will happen is that the Christian language gets inflected in different ways. And for me, that becomes broader ways, if you like. Broader ways because these processes of the incarnating can be there and are there within Judaism, within Islam, for example, within Hinduism. And so it becomes not that I am talking about an ultimate reality, not that I am talking about Kantian language as just constructing domains. I don't believe that. I see language as actually so powerfully involved in the soul timing, in what happens in soul time. We need a language, but we need to constantly find the language. The language cannot be got rid of so we can all join in some kind of universal one reality. That is not what I'm saying.
All right, let me follow that question if I may, because I had, as I listened to that third lecture, I thought about Justin Martyr and Origen. I mean, since I think about things in terms of the ancient world, but Justin Martyr's famous spermatikoi logoi and the Logos, or Origen's understanding of the incarnation in De Principiis, which is universally possible for all people, but just happens to have happened in one person, in Origen's thought. Could you, for the sake of those of us who think in such frameworks of thought, could you distinguish your thesis from, say, what Origen says about incarnation, the incarnation of the Logos in human beings? Because I think you are saying something different, quite different, but it would be helpful if you could just tease out those differences.
Well, if I said the difference between certainly what Origen, Justin Martyr, I think is different because what's going on in Justin Martyr, it seems to me, is a process of translation as much as anything else. That is, you know, it's an apologetic process where he is moving, trying to infuse Greek metaphysics and use that kind of language to say something about Christian theology. With Origen, where I would differ, and this would come down to my Christology, and I do have a Christology, because my attention is to the material incarnating, not the metaphysics that Origen would actually be requiring. And that is, if you like, cashed out in my Christology, which is a very, you know, when I work with my Christology in the last volume, the Ethical Life, Volume 2, I'm talking about a Christology that centers around encountering the historical figure of Jesus as the Christ, and the way in which trying to create and describe, which is obviously difficult because these are filtered testimonies, whatever, that you get within the scriptures. but nevertheless, there are ripples of the encounter aspect, which are material in terms of emotional effect. For example, being astonished, being terrified, being disturbed, being elated. So if I were to distinguish what I'm doing, in many ways, what I am doing in my dogmatic theology is a logos Christology, pretty much like Origen is doing. Where I differ is I am moving towards, if you like, the material. I want the materiality in there, not the metaphysical frameworks. So in fact, I'm not eschewing metaphysics. I don't think you can eschew metaphysics in theology, but I am not giving attention to the speculative metaphysics that Origen will give attention to. Mine, I want to be deeply rooted in our earthness, because it seems to me that our earthness is the point where the incarnation comes to be recognized as such and impacts upon us.
Okay, thank you. I want to remind the audience to please pose your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll pose them to Graham and let him respond to each questioner. So please don't be shy. But while we're waiting for more to come in, I have other questions I'm anxious to pose. So in your second lecture, which I did really enjoy the analysis of Ansel Adams, and what was that, the clean
reality of granite.
Reality of granite, yes. And I was thinking about El Capitan and Half Dome, etc. I was thinking, and then you made a comment at the end which suggested that I was thinking probably incorrectly, but my line of thought was, does this suggest a more of a panentheistic understanding of the divine in your way of thinking, and this encounter where we as creation become creative in encountering creation as one with ourselves, or is that unnecessary? That is the panentheistic type of understanding.
I think that, let me approach this because in some ways this does relate to the first, and it will relate in some ways to the second question. It seems to me that phenomenologically, as in our experience with, or Anselm Adams' experience with, the presence of the mountain. And in fact, people have written emails to me about their own ways in which mountains do have that presence with them. So it is a recognized phenomenon. You get actually biographies of climbers that talk about them becoming one with the mountain. They study the mountain, they work with the mountain, particularly free climbers, that they're actually trying to work with the mountain so the mountain will keep them safe. They believe in the mountain keeping them safe, and things like that. Now, it seems to me that when we start applying a language of theism, panentheism, pantheism, that doesn't do anything to the experience that they actually have. It doesn't it doesn't enrich their experience, because the experience is one of encounter. In the theological, it seems to me that, in fact, and this is very much part of my systematic theology, which is and this can't be divorced from what I'm doing as a systematic theologian. I come back time and time again to two scriptures. One, our lives are hidden in Christ, in God. That dative locative N, it's actually with Christ, in God. And the other one is that God is in all things, through all things. Okay, pantheism, panentheism, and above all things. And that is the important one. Where this cashes out, it seems to me, in what I'm trying to say in these lectures, is in what I try to distinguish between harmony and consonance. And in that lecture with Anselm Adams, Adams uses the language of harmony. And it's the way in which I think a deeper reflection there is needed, because in all these things, there is not harmony, there is otherness. And that's what I try to bring out when I'm discussing his photograph of the Cathedral Rock Cliffs and the Merced River, that in fact, this is not about harmony. There's a deep tension going on here. There's the mountain questions him, if you like, disrupts his own sense of himself. And that becomes important for the way, you know, again, I'm not talking about homologies here. I'm not talking about how the microcosm and the macrocosm all link together nicely, and we're all kind of in the one reality, which comes back to the first question. No, the otherness of the other is shocking, and it disrupts the nature of easy harmonies. And so what is going on then is I turn to a word that constantly is used by Augustine and is constantly translated in the English as harmony, and that is consonantia, which is sounding with. It's more like what Arvo Pärt describes as tintinnabulation. It's the vibrations of something hitting with that you can't quite grasp, but you're involved in it and participating in it. So no, for me, this will not fit into, you know, Kathy Keller's understanding of pantheism or panentheism. It won't, because that to me does not respect the way in which the mountain can turn on you, or the mountain can be utterly indifferent. And the same with the sea. It can be destructive as well as it can furnish. And it seems to me that our existence then with the things that make up our planet are not all harmonious with us being here. But we sound with them. And it's the same with the relationship then between ourselves and the divine. There is not a harmony that would make panentheism or pantheism, to me, a legitimate description. It's just that at a phenomenological level of encountering the mountain or being in the water, those languages don't have much descriptive to the power to them.
Thank you. I think that's a very clear answer. I appreciate it very much. Let's pose another question from the audience. Could you kindly elaborate a little more on the redemptive dimension of our woundings and how they could be related to soul time? Can you also give a concrete illustration, or a couple of them, illustrations, examples, from the insights of the artists or scholars you mentioned in your lectures? And I assume that means to the ways in which our woundings are related to soul time.
Thank you. This is a difficult one. It's a difficult one because woundings are woundings. And yes, I see the redemptive nature of those woundings. I'll give you one example from one of the artists that we looked at, and that's Turner. Turner grew up in it wasn't quite poverty, because his father was a hairdresser and barber, and had a bit of a shop around where the brothels and pubs were in Covent Garden. You know, it was not the most salubrious area of London you could actually be in. So it's not poverty so much with Turner, though it did affect him. What really affected, there were two things in his life that totally, I think, affected him. First of all, his mother was mad. And for a long time, he and his father and well, just he and his father really, because his sister died and that was a very powerful moment for him. She died probably from some kind of poisoning of the air. I mentioned the volcano, and he himself was probably affected by this, and his lungs affected by this, which is why constantly he has problems to do with his breathing. But it's his relationship with his mother. She was very violent in being mad. It was a very, very difficult upbringing with his mother and his father trying to fight off his mother. Eventually things got so bad, they had to put her into a mental institution, and in a particularly poor mental institution. But that affected from a very early on all his relationships with women. So later on, he has a relationship with a woman and has 2 children, which he owns as his children, hardly ever sees her. Makes no mention of the children in his will, nothing. Attends one of his children's weddings, but has nothing to do with her. Later on in life, he links up with somebody who is a widow, and just lives with her. The damage done throughout his life just meant that he had to find ways in which he could not only express what he's doing in his in feeling what he's doing in relation to his seascapes and his landscapes, and but he is wrestling for a language which will enable him to actually battle through some of the difficulties, psychological and physiological differences that haunted him. And in many ways, his art, if it was redemptive for him, I think it was because he always didn't feel it was going well. And towards the end of his life, he was not always regarded as being the genius that he is now being regarded, and needed actually people like Ruskin to support the fact that this man is exceptionally a genius. But in fact, what his art issues from is the wrestling with the pain and the ongoing kind of sense of, how does this work for him? So the creativity is absolutely necessary as a therapeutics, if you like. Where does the redemption come in? First of all, we just got to get rid of this idea that we've got some progressive redemptive. Redemption's not linear, it seems to me. I can't say to what extent I am more or less redeemed than I began all this 50 years ago, if you like, becoming a Christian and going to church. I just can't say where the redemptive cashes itself out. The whole redemptive nature is an act of faith, like staring at the cross and seeing that in fact there is a resurrection at the other side of it. we work towards what we, by faith, accept as redemptive. Where the redemption of Turner comes in for me is in what the art produces in those of us who observe it and feel what's going on, and feel both the tension and the enormous sense of an untamable beauty that's actually there in his paintings, which he is wrestling with all the time, seeing both the beautiful and the utterly destructive at the same time, and wanting to balance the utterly destructive with the painful and the beautiful. And I think that Yeats called it the terrible beauty, and I think actually that language of the paradox, we hold together both the wounding and the redemption. Where it's become really quite important for me, because I've had some awful experiences happen in my own life as well, which actually I didn't bring into this, but I do actually bring them into the book I'm writing. I didn't want to come to the language of trauma without actually knowing something about it, and how trauma can paralyze. Sorry, that's my clicking, I don't quite know, but how trauma can paralyze. And we've seen people paralyzed, and I have been paralyzed by incidents that have actually happened. And finding a way to get beyond the trauma, which will never go away. Some of the things that Turner experienced, he could never forget those experiences. They were written into him, written onto him. But nevertheless, finding a language in which he could do something that was creative with that wounding enabled a possibility of seeing something. And certainly for us on the other side, we receive something from that wounding. It's not an easy, and where it's become more difficult for me, I think, is in actually just trying to reflect upon the fact that, and I think I mentioned this in a lecture, in the book of Revelation, Jesus still has his wounds, as if this wounding is eternal, all right? And that, we think of redemption in some kind of holism, that everything is going to be perfected, as if we knew what perfected was. Sometimes I think we think redemption is actually that we were 30, absolutely fit, toned, physically tanned, and ultimately devastatingly attractive. And I just don't think, I think we're going to be surprised. In being known as in knowing as we are known, I think we're going to be in for some surprises. But it does seem to me that both the wounding remains eternal, and if it remains eternal, it remains in the redemption. And that, to me, comes back to questions to do with why in John's Gospel the cross is the site of not only torture, but exaltation. It's that paradox. It's that paradox. And in every one of the artists that I'm discussing, except for Carlos Nakai, who, try as I might, I can't find any kind of biographical details really, other than the most evident ones about him. But in every one of the people I write, I talk to you about the haunting sense in Anselm Adams, for example. If you read his biography, it sounds as though this was an idyllic marriage. It was not an idyllic marriage. It was a very hard marriage. and that actually put him into a sanatorium and caused all sorts of questions, which only kind of vaguely emerged because he edited so severely his letters, and he edited anything to do with the incidents that happened in the sanatorium. Every one of the people, and I could talk about Marilyn Robinson in the same way, every one of the people have actually experienced wounding, deep wounding. And in some ways, their artistry emerges in order to cope with that wounding. In Ethical Life 2, I deal with this by showing some artists don't cope. Virginia Woolf commits suicide. Conrad constantly was contemplating suicide. Rothko commits suicide. Some of them do not make it through the wounding. I don't know what that means about redemption. I do know what it means in terms of the redemptive value of me looking at a Rothko. I do know that. In fact, but then maybe we've got to understand redemption not as being about me, but about a whole kind of activity of soul time in which all other people are connected.
Well, I will say thank you for the listener who posed a question and for all of us. So no, that's very helpful. I was thinking about Van Gogh would be another example. Next question. This comes from a very well-known liturgist who's just recently retired at a different institution, but very well-known and has ties to Yale. Do you find, as I do, the relation between materiality and voice or sound in so many Psalms? I think just now of Psalm 29, water, cedars, fire. Glory is phenomenologically or phenomenally in a lyrical form of awe. So how do you react to the Psalter and to the language there and its use of the elements?
In fact, in Ethical Life 1, I do a whole piece on Psalm 29 because of the way voice comes in. My understanding of, go right back to the first question about logos and the inner logos. You don't need the word logos. You could talk of the way in which the divine voice, it's about creation as communicating the divine, as voicing what is the divine. And so there's a lot in that. Particularly, I find the human voice one of the most subtle instruments there is. And it's one of the things that when I was dealing with air, I wanted to bring in the flautist. I could have brought in a singer, but you actually want the nakedness of the singing, not what they're singing, because the voice is such a range and subtlety. It is one of the delights of being here at the cathedral and listening to the cathedral choir. To me, and it's one of the sadnesses that the choral tradition is really under threat within the Church of England, because that choral tradition is just so powerful in terms of worship. And why did it? It does seem to me it's not just the collective rah 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 of a chorus. It's actually the way in which the breath is brought out of you, and and sometimes I actually I've actually said at some point, I can tell the quality of someone's spiritual life by the way they speak. And that's not, oh, they're perfect or whatever, but the tone of their voice, I can tell, you can tell when someone's putting it on. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing worse than someone getting up to preach and you hear the preacher and you don't want to hear the preacher. You want to hear the human being, you know, and all the time that kind of that attention to the voice. I think the voice it's the instrument within us that's built within us. You know, we can clap our hands, but in fact, the voice is you know, we can externalize the voice in musical instruments, but the voice is actually that which is internal within us and depends upon a whole physiology that's related to breathing and the articulation of sound. It's what makes, you know, what good writers aim for is not dramatic or even believable characters. It's a voice. It's that which says, you will recognize from this voice. You do it with Marilyn Robinson. You recognize from the voice, from the very first paragraphs, that you're reading a novel by Marilyn Robinson. No one writes with that voice. She gives you that voice. And it's the same, you know, Keats is different from Shelley, though they may actually talk about some of the very same things. The voice is different. And it seems to me that what great poets do is craft the way in which the voice can be verbalized. You know, you get someone like Hopkins, you know, he hears every single word, the rhythm. The first part of Ethical Life 2, which is on consonants, is actually an essay on, you have to learn to read Augustine. You will never understand what Augustine is saying if you strip out the sound of the Latin sentences, the sonorous, sinuous nature of his prose. It is just finely tuned. So voice, the Psalms, yes, because I think, in fact, I would quite happily change the internal voice for the external voice, because it's about that communication that is going on. And I think Psalm 29, particularly because it is one of the old, well, it's assumed to be, or a bit thought to be, one of the oldest psalms in the Psalm. And it is also supposed to be a reply to an Ugaritic hymn to the storm god Baal. So I just think it's absolutely wonderful, and wonderful the way in languages, that kind of the inner sense of a language comes through hearing it, not reading it, but actually hearing it. When I'm in South Africa, and I'm going to stop here, but when I'm in South Africa, one of the most pleasant things I hear, and I don't speak in any African language, but you can hear with the clicks and the whistles, you can hear the whole landscape in the way they speak. And I don't understand a word of it, but you can hear the whole landscape in the way that they're speaking.
Let me change the line of questioning just slightly. I was fascinated by all of the different artists whom you chose to feature in the 3 lectures. And I'm wondering, when you think of other artists, and you've mentioned a good number even today in your comments, but how do you find the soul time, those who have experienced what you're calling soul time in the art? Because it may be, I mean, I could think of, I mentioned Van Gogh, for example, whose paintings I dearly love, very different than Monet. And I love his paintings too. But how are you attuned when you read artists who write or see art or see photographs, what are the signals for you that this artist has experienced soul time?
Well, I think everyone will experience that inner formation that happens just on the way in which they are encountering and negotiating and thinking through the experiences, you know. So I think it's not. I'll confess now that I have some problems with soul time, and I may in fact drop the whole question of soul time, and actually use the language of inscape, which is the language that Gerard Manley Hopkins uses, and the way the inscape actually correlates to various landscapes, seascapes, cloudscapes, etc. But you know, where I see it, I see sometimes it can be disguised. Young writers, for example, who want to fulfill literary ambitions, and so they're modeling, they're ventriloquizing other people's work, you know, and that's a necessary stage to actually get through. Turner actually did exactly the same with other painters, and there's a beautiful example where Turner comes across a painting of the Nativity by Rembrandt, and he comes across it because there weren't art galleries in those days. So and he's seen paintings all the time, you know, all the time, because he's at the art school, and he comes across this painting by Turner in one of his patrons' houses, and his patron is the one who actually writes, because we have very little that's written by Turner himself. His patron actually writes, he just stood there weeping, and actually said he will never do something as beautiful as that. Yeah, in fact, he in fact did, but it's the way it communicates. It communicates, and sometimes with a young writer or a writer who is careless, you know, it's an imitation. It's not happening. I think there's a degree of subjectivity in this, you know, that sometimes it happens, you know, that communication happens in some things that, for me, that other people, I mean, I've found other people, you know, just can't bear Mark Rothko, whereas, you know, I'm just speechless before a Rothko abstraction, you know, or they just can't go, they don't see it at all, or, you know, someone even more particular, you know, but you know it suddenly, if it goes back to the last question, suddenly there is a communication, there's a voice here, and the voice can be in painting, or it can be in sculpture, or it can be in any form, but there is something here that's speaking, and it's making me listen. And the other side of this is, so you've got to read slowly. You're not going to pick up the communication if you read. You know, my son reads 100 pages in an hour. I said, that's not reading, it's consumption.
Is he still a student?
I think, you know, this is part of the difficulty sometimes, that, you know, we give out reading lists to our students that no human being could ever read all that, ever. And in fact, if they could read selectively, they'll get much more out of what they read than actually trying to read through the whole book list. So because it takes time in front of a painting, you know, and sometimes it actually takes you, you have to be taught. Sometimes you have to be taught, you know, sometimes, you know, you don't have the language to express what you're feeling, and you're trying to, but it's that way in which I'm drawn to those people who just hit me. And it's not, oh, I understand what's going on, but hit me in ways that, whoa, I don't, I mean, I could have chosen any number of the wonderful photographs of Ansel Adams of El Capitan, you know, they don't hit me in the same way as Sequoia roots hit me. You know, they just don't hit me. And I can see why he's wrestling with wanting to not do the picturesque and not be arty. And you know, it's when they hit me.
I'll make one last comment and then give you a chance to say anything you'd like to offer words of conclusion. I keep thinking of the statement of the French critic Paul Valéry, and I'm not sure I can quote it, but I can paraphrase it, I think, accurately. He said, "The real genius in poetry is not for the poet to experience the poetic state. It is to create it in the reader."
Yeah. Yeah.
And your comments make me think of that statement.
Yeah. And that, you know, I often think of when we're writing our books, that when the book comes out, there's something that's just completely finished. It's reified for me, and so can sit on that shelf, and I probably never read it again, right? Because its life will not be on my bookshelf. Its life will be in other people who read it. And I think it's the same with anyone. And I do see writing theology as an art form. It's an expressive art form. We're not trying to just convey information. We are trying to convey something more than information. But we have a task, and we do the task. And there's a lovely line in a poem by D.H. Lawrence that says, and it could have been written by Walt Whitman, but it's D.H. Lawrence, not me, but the wind that blows through me.
Ah. Yeah, wonderful.
And I think it's that kind of sense. No, and that's the humility. No, it's not. It's and you know, most of these artists live really kind of difficult lives, solitary lives. You know, Marilyn Robinson is a very lonely woman in many ways, and she brings that across in everything she actually writes. She will talk about lonesomeness, but yes, this is solitude, but it's not about them. It's not about them. It's about the communication, the passing on what has been passed to them. Does that help?
It does. Can you remind us of when you think your book will be complete and who will publish it? Do you have any ideas, just so everybody knows? Okay.
No, I don't know. And this book, I am not wanting to put under contract, and I'm not fulfilling a contract by it. I wanted this book, I want to emerge as it emerges, and then, you know, I'll see what happens. So it will probably be completed actually by about Easter time, but when it's published, who it's published by, I have no idea. Well,
as a true partisan, I will invite you to submit it to Yale University Press. I will certainly endorse it. So, Graham, on behalf of the entire school and on behalf of the people who've been watching, I know that after Monday's lecture, I haven't seen after the others, but I know Monday, there were over 700 views by Tuesday afternoon. So the lectures have been widely viewed. And we're very grateful for your thoughtfulness, for your insights, for letting the wind blow through you to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would just like to say thank you to the Divinity School and the invitation, because I was in lockdown, because we thought about doing it last year, and I was in lockdown, and if we'd have been doing it last year, then it would have probably been about the ethical life too, and I would have chosen things from ethical life too. But actually, it was during lockdown that, and I was working with the proofs for ethical life too, and I thought, no, I want to give them something that isn't finished, and flies kites, and this is what I'm working on, because I think actually, I find that students, they want to hear not the finished product. They go through drafts. As I say, I will probably drop Soul Time and use Inkscape, because it's coming to me now as something that happens better than Soul Time for me. And that's just the way of the process. But thank you for the invitation, because it enabled me to get the things together that I wanted to say and showcase some of the stuff that's not finished and not polished. And, it is what I'm working on now, which is what I wanted to do. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you also to Lynn and Jennifer and Kathy for their different introductions, and for you for chairing this, Greg. It's been absolutely wonderful. There are two people I do want to mention, and for thanks, and that definitely is Lynn Havasat, who took me through panicking moments of all the forms that needed to be filled in, which I thought it's going to take me a week to actually do all this, but she patiently took me through all the forms. And a real thank you to Brock. I know he's there in the background, but Brock Harmon, I could not have done these without you. And you are the one who presented them and actually enabled it to happen. We had to record these when I was on the Isle of Mull, which is my home. And on one day, there was just a storm going on outside, and we were still having to carry on and actually get these done. So, and he was just so patient. So we will have that pint one day, Brock. I promise you we will. But thank you to him. And that's it. Thank you.
And I will echo his sentiments and thanks to Brock and Lynn. So to all of you, best wishes. And Graham, we hope we someday can get you here back to this campus and see you face to face. Best wishes.